So I am blessed to have two amazing, vivacious daughters, ages 14 and 7. And they have taught me more about life and love than any teacher or book or religion. And on Father's Day, I often reflect on my role as Sage and Adia's dad. It's when I perform a self-audit. It's when I ask myself, have I done enough and been enough for both of them this year? And I will admit that I often have my fair share of self-doubts. Like many fathers, I worry that as a father, I'm not good enough. But I honestly can't imagine how much bigger those nagging doubts might be if I had had sons rather than daughters. And that is not meant to be a joke. You can ask my wife, Sunny. Since I was a teenager, I have been scared to death by the prospect that I might one day be the father of a boy or boys. And that is because I didn't have the best relationship with my father growing up. And so I never directly experienced how a good father raises a good son to become a good man. And whether or not you have a good father to help you navigate that path, becoming a good man is really hard these days. Certainly harder than it was, say, 30 years ago when I was a boy. What does it mean to be a man? I don't have a good answer for you. Certainly not a simple answer. And the many answers that our boys are exposed to today are frankly oppressive, self-destructive, and toxic. We have in this country a masculinity problem. Boys are taught from an early age that to be a man, they must suppress emotion, that they must portray strength at all times and at all costs, that weakness and vulnerability are sins unto death, which often literally lead to death because men refuse to practice self-care and visit the doctor to ensure their physical and psychological health. Men are taught that violence is glorious, that women are sexual objects to be consumed. This masculinity problem has grown into a crisis, and it is at the root of so many of the problems facing our nation today. It is the reason we have a rape culture in this country that has led to the necessity of a Me Too movement. It's the driving force animating MRAs. If you have not heard of this, MRA is an acronym that stands for Men's Rights Activists. As you might infer from their name, they are men, predominantly heterosexual, cisgender white men who believe that women today have more rights and more privileges than they do, and that they, in fact, are the oppressed and marginalized ones in our current culture. A particularly dangerous and terrifying subset of MRAs are known as incels. Incel stands for involuntarily celibate. Incels are deeply misogynistic men who desperately want but fail to obtain female romantic partners. They believe that all men should be entitled to have free access to sex with women, and their frustrations have led them to become resentful, rage-filled terrorists. Just this past April, an incel member murdered 10 people in an attack in Toronto. We ought not be surprised. 90% of all homicides in this country are committed by men. Nearly 95% of all mass shootings are perpetrated by men. Following the mass school shooting in Parkland, Florida this past February, comedian and author Michael Ian Black submitted a thoughtful opinion piece to the New York Times about the brokenness of America's boys. He wrote, "Too many boys are trapped in the same suffocating, outdated model of masculinity, where manhood is measured in strength, where there is no way to be vulnerable without being emasculated, where manliness is about having power over others. These boys are trapped, and they don't even have the language to talk about how they feel about being trapped, because the language that exists to discuss the full range of human emotion is still viewed as sensitive and feminine. We don't know how to be, and we're terrified. But to even admit our terror is to be reduced, because we don't have a model of masculinity that allows for fear or grief or tenderness or the day-to-day sadness that sometimes overtakes us all. There has to be a way to expand what it means to be a man without losing our masculinity. As I thought about Mr. Black's assessment and considered possible candidates who could answer his call for a new model of manhood, my mind actually settled upon a rather familiar name, a name that you've heard a lot this year. That's because this year is the 50th anniversary of the day that we all first stepped foot in his neighborhood. I love Mr. Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers, here was a man, not a woman, not a puppet, not a cartoon character, but a flesh and blood man. And how important is that? But it was a flesh and blood man who every day nurtured children by displaying compassion and gentleness and authenticity. Not only did he teach an entire generation all the public virtues you expose today would never touch, he taught us about grief, about anger, divorce, death, even war. If there is indeed a cure for toxic masculinity, he may have it. Consider these quotes that he gifted to us over the years. There's no should or should not when it comes to having feelings. They're part of who we are, and their origins are beyond our control. When we believe that, we may find it easier to make constructive choices. No, when I was angry, well, they didn't mind that. So that's what I did. And then little by little, I'd see the music was sounding less and less angry. It does give you a good feeling to know that there's something you can do to become the master of the mad that you feel and not have to hurt yourself or somebody else. And this might be my favorite. People have said, "Don't cry," to other people for years and years. And all it has ever meant is, I'm too uncomfortable when you show your feelings. Don't cry. I'd rather have them say, go ahead and cry. I'm here to be with you. Mr. Rogers was an amazing person, an amazing man, and an amazing male role model. But was he actually an example of amazing masculinity? This is where things get a little complicated because of the differences between biological sex, gender, and gender role stereotypes. Do not get me wrong, don't misquote me. Mr. Rogers was amazing. I love Mr. Rogers. But the more specific adjectives that we use to generally describe Mr. Rogers, they include words such as nurturing, caring, compassionate, gentle, in touch with his feelings. Now, these virtues are, by and large, with my funny quotes, traditionally feminine. Without resorting to verbal legerdemain, there is very little traditionally masculine about Mr. Rogers. So, is he really an example of positive masculinity? Or is he an example of a positive biological male who comfortably and authentically houses an abundance of very positive and traditionally feminine qualities? In which case, he was a cutting-edge gender bender like David Bowie. No wonder Mr. Rogers was so cool. Now, the answer to this question I'm posing may be more significant than you might first imagine. In other words, did Mr. Rogers redeem masculinity, or did he abandon it in order to embrace more feminine qualities? Because if that's what he did, and if he is then lifted up and celebrated as the paragon of positive male role models, then this could be interpreted to suggest that all masculinity is by definition toxic, and therefore the only path of salvation for biological males is for all of them to shed those masculine values and adopt traditionally feminine ones. And that is what the incels, MRAs, and the alt-right fear is happening in this country right now, that we are seeing a massive cultural shift that says there is no room for masculinity of any kind. They are terrified that the future truly is female, and that they therefore will have to become female in order to keep up. Now, these groups at present have a huge scholar crush on a gentleman by the name of Jordan Peterson. You've probably heard of him. He is the intellectual darling of these male-dominated groups right now. Now, Peterson himself does not necessarily espouse all of these groups' hardline beliefs, but he also doesn't do much to separate himself from these fanboys and make them uncomfortable enough to leave him. Anyway, Peterson, a psychologist by trade, has made an interesting prediction, or an observation. He writes, if men are pushed too hard to feminize, they will become more and more interested in harsh, fascist political ideology. In other words, if fragile men are pressured to feel less manly, they will rebel by overcompensation and become uber-manly fascists. Now, the objective validity of Peterson's statement is certainly open to debate, but what is probably undeniable is that incels, MRAs, and the alt-right have fully bought into this idea and have made it a part of their own narrative. Liberals, progressives, neo-Marxists, postmodernists, they're all trying to turn us into women, and we're gonna fight back. So for all men, but especially for the poor lost souls housed in male bodies who feel threatened by Mr. Rogers and all that he potentially represents, it might be useful to identify virtues that have a traditionally masculine flavor, but have been disentangled from toxic, destructive, and self-destructive extremes. So a question to ask, what might that masculinity look like? Well, perhaps that masculinity would value assertiveness, but an assertiveness that doesn't cross the line into aggressiveness. Perhaps that masculinity would still value strength, but a strength that is used to help others instead of bullying or exploiting others. Perhaps that masculinity celebrates courage, including the courage to admit that sometimes we are all afraid. Perhaps it is a masculinity that lifts up self-reliance, but a self-reliance that is tempered by the wisdom to know that you can't do everything by yourself. Perhaps that masculinity will still promote being tough, but not so tough that you ignore your body, your mind, or your soul when they tell you that something is very wrong. Perhaps that masculinity will demand living by a strict code of honor, even among a group of equals who keep each other accountable, like maybe a covenant-based church, for instance. I don't know. So perhaps this is the model of a masculinity redeemed, a gender role that can be espoused by men who find it important to self-identify as masculine. And you know what, I'm not gonna lie, that probably includes me. All of those virtues appeal to me. But on the other hand, then I think, why do I need to think that these virtues should belong primarily to men? Or that they are even especially manly? Lots of women value assertiveness, strength, courage, self-reliance, toughness, and honor. And lots of men value compassion, gentleness, cooperation, and harmony. So then I have to remind myself that I might be thinking one-dimensionally again. Here is a big secret that's actually been around for a while. Masculinity and femininity are not mutually exclusionary. In the late 1970s, psychologist Sandra Bem came up with a new way to conceptualize masculinity and femininity. Instead of seeing them as opposite poles on a single axis like this, where the closer you get to one end, the farther you move from the other, like the more masculine you become, the less feminine you become. Instead of viewing it that way, Bem created a biaxial model with both an X and a Y axis. One axis represented masculinity and one axis represented femininity. So in this model, a person could be both very masculine and very feminine at the same time. So if Bem is right, men can become feminine without losing one iota of masculinity, and women can become more masculine without losing one iota of their femininity. But perhaps even more importantly, experts in the fields of gender studies and queer studies have pretty much conclusively divorced gender from biological sex. This is a new reality many of us are just starting to understand. And I don't think that that genie is ever going to go back into the bottle. It is truly a revolutionary idea. Femininity and masculinity are constructs created by the human mind. Like all categories, they are imaginary and somewhat arbitrary linguistic circles that we have drawn around certain adjectives that sometimes cluster in people who are biologically male or biologically female. Some of these gendered traits are socialized into people, and other traits do in fact seem to have a root in biology. For example, we know certain behaviors and attitudes are correlated to levels of various hormones in the body. But the line between which traits are purely biological and which traits are purely socialized is blurry at best. And as it relates to prescribing social roles for individuals based on their biological sex, it's frankly irrelevant. Estrogen and testosterone levels in human bodies, male, female, intersex, or otherwise, they are breathtakingly variable due to any number of factors. And these hormone levels change significantly over time due to any number of causes. So even biological sex is a poor proxy for determining whether one acts and thinks and feels masculine, feminine, both, neither, or something else entirely. And so I say all of this to get to this point. I think that if we look deep into the crystal ball, decades from now, we will see these concepts of masculinity and femininity, and perhaps gender altogether. We will see that they will have lost all practical meaning. We will have stopped using them because we will have realized these categories do more harm than good. You may think I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Professor Heath Fogg Davis of Temple University imagines such a possibility in his 2017 book, Beyond Trans, Does Gender Matter? Davis himself, a transgender man, writes, demanding that people conform to stereotypes of masculinity or femininity does everybody harm. So instead of trying to fit more people into society's pre-existing categories, we might try rethinking whether we need those categories at all. I think that eventually we will stop sorting behaviors, attitudes, and values into gender categories altogether. And if the concepts of masculinity and femininity do continue to exist, they will do so purely as loose descriptors with absolutely no normative force. That is, no one will be expected to act, think, or feel a certain way based on their biological sex at all. Everyone will be free to express themselves and their gender identities however they see fit. There will be no social punishment or stigma if boys act like girls, girls act like boys, boys act like boys, girls act like girls, or any other permutation between or beyond those artificial binaries. There will be no stigma or social punishment for being attracted to whomever you like, for inhabiting whatever body you want. There will be no pressure for people to fulfill social gender roles at all, and thus less incentive for people to cling to toxic and unhealthy stereotypes. Now, science will continue to recognize that certain behaviors and attitudes may be more likely to express themselves in individuals based on anatomy, hormones, brain biology, chromosomes, and socialization. But I suspect we won't use gender or even sex as a cheap proxy anymore to draw those conclusions. In this future I see, people will be people. Their differences will be celebrated, not feared, and it will be beautiful. But that future is still far, far away. Today, we still have children, and especially boys, young men and old men too, still struggling to understand themselves, struggling to find their place, struggling to fit into narrowly prescribed social roles, or struggling to pull away from them. And it is causing incredible harm, incredible pain, confusion, and shame. So until tomorrow becomes today, what are we to do? I might suggest returning to the wisdom of Mr. Rogers. He once said, as human beings, our job in life is to help people realize how rare and valuable each one of us really is, that each of us has something that no one else has or ever will have, something inside that is unique to all time. And it's our job to encourage each other to discover that uniqueness and to provide ways of developing its expression. This core belief is what inspired Mr. Rogers to end every show by telling his audience, "You've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are." Some days, even as adults, we need to hear that, don't we? So if you'll allow me to do my best Mr. Rogers impersonation, I like you just the way you are. And I promise you, someone else needs to hear those words today too, and they just may need to hear it from you. So find them and tell them. Blessed be. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join us in singing our closing hymn, number 168, One More Step.